We've got our next speaker, Shinesa Cambric, up next. Shinesa leads a team of security architects at Vistra, which is a Fortune 300 energy company, pretty big organization. Prior to that, she led identity and access management at Fossil. And when we first got connected and spoke over Zoom, it was clear her exuberance, positivity just flowed through the screen. So excited that you're here, Shinesa, speaking about securing cloud identity. So I'll hand it over to you.
So thank you everyone for joining my session today. I will be honest and say it's a little tough to follow and act like AJ, but I'm glad to be here. And I also want to thank Frank Kim, Dennis Scandrett, and Jennifer Santiago for the opportunity to present today and talk about the strategy for identity in depth with your cloud environment. So a little bit about me. My name is Shinesa Cambric. I've been in the IT industry for over 18 years. I've had positions within application security, identity and access management, and security architecture. And I'm a very big proponent of mentoring and pulling others into the cybersecurity space. So today what we'll look at is some of the foundations of identity and what I mean by cloud identity. I think I may have a little bit of a unique spin when I say cloud identity. Next, we'll look at the different layers of identity that exist within the cloud, and then we'll look at different tools within the different cloud providers that you can use to build your defense in depth strategy. So to get started and to set the tone a little bit, I have a video that I'd like to quickly play.
Mr. Cow.
Yes?
How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
I don't know. I always end up biting. Ask Mr. Fox, for he's much cleverer than I.
Mr. Fox, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
Why don't you ask Mr. Turtle, for he's been around a lot longer than I. Me, I bite.
Mr. Turtle, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
I never made it without biting. Ask Mr. Owl, for he is the wisest of us all.
Mr. Owl, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
A good question. Let's find out. 1, 2, 3, 3.
If there's anything I can't stand, it's a smart owl.
How many licks does?
So hopefully I'm not the only one today that's old enough to remember when that commercial first came out. And you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with identity and a talk on defense in depth? But I actually think there's a parallel to how people think of identity, especially things like multi-factor authentication and our environments. So you could think of multi-factor authentication as that one hard outer shell that's protecting something sensitive on the inside. And you could see as the boy went to the different characters, that one hard outer shell was enough to deter those attackers. But eventually he got to somebody who took a little bit of a different approach and was able to bypass that layer. And that's why I think we need to have a defense in depth when it comes to identity. Multi-factor is great and hopefully we're all using it, but that can't be the only layer that we put in place for our systems. And a few of the other speakers today talked about this as well, but with cloud, we need to have a shift in our mindset of what the perimeter is. Identity now becomes that fence or that gateway of who goes in and who comes out of our environments. And in the past, people thought of identity as something being really simplistic. So you set up an ID, you assign access, you give it a password, and that's it. However, with the cloud environment, I think it's become more apparent to people how complex this really can be. And as an identity practitioner, I think we really need to give kudos to AWS because they have the most complex strategy of all. And I think within the IT industry, now that's being really apparent. So a little bit more about the shift with cloud identity and what I mean about identities. It's no longer about a human person. There's this identity of things. So thinking about smartwatches, mobile phones, your laptop, APIs, IP addresses, and even third parties. All of that needs to be considered within the scope of identity for your environments. And then there's a few questions that we'll want to ask along the way to determine what is a relevant identity for our specific companies. So, paying attention to where are you sending data to and from? So what are the connection points? Who's receiving that data? Who's sending that data? Other things you'll want to consider is, what's the level of access that's being assigned to those different identities? So thinking about service accounts and making sure that those are being set up in a least privileged way. Even with your bot IDs, again, making sure that you're only giving the level of access that's really required for those identities. And then another thing that we need to think about is when should connectivity should take place. A lot of times when we think about attacks, we're looking at it from the outside in, but we really need to assess it also from the inside out. Insider threats are just as real as outside attacks. And so being aware of, when should activity be taking place within your environment and is that behavior appropriate, will lead you to other controls for identity. So I think in AJ's presentation, he actually set me up pretty well with this and showing you guys the CLI and the access to root. Here, let's think of an engineer or developer who's building some proof of concept resource, and they're putting that resource out into the world. It's accessible through the internet. And because it's a proof of concept, they're not really worried about, identity and security configurations. So they're giving it as much access as they can to make sure this proof of concept works. But the problem here is that as soon as that resource is outside on the internet and available, it's going to be discovered. And this is the opportunity for an attacker to come into your environment, do some lateral movement, possibly further escalate their privileges, and then access critical resources through your environment. And the entry point here, again, is that identity. So now that I've laid a little bit of groundwork, let's also talk about the foundations of identity. And for me, there's 4 main pillars when it comes to identity. The first being identity governance. And so you could think of this as one of the overarching pillars. Here, you'll want to make sure that you have a repository of identities for your system and that you have a way to know what those identities are doing. The next is access management. So how do you provision access? How do you know what's in those roles that are being assigned, those permissions that are being granted? The next layer is authentication. So here you want to think about, single sign-on or, zero trust methodology. So a way to get away from passwords being reused within your system. And then the last item that I have here is your privileged access. So going back to your root users and default admin users and making sure that those are appropriately locked down or being logged. And with your defense in depth, so I kind of categorize these in 3 different ways. The first being a preventative type of control. And this is going to be based on the type of threats to your environment. So here, this is all about, stopping an attack from occurring. Going back to our Tootsie Pop scenario though, you'll have one type of preventative control for one type of scenario, but it's not going to cover everything. So again, you'll have to layer this on within your environment. The next type would be deterrent. So those type of things that make an attacker think that it's not worth it to attack your environment. Here again, going back to the Tootsie Pop scenario, it wasn't worth it to the first couple of characters to try to get through that hard shell, but it was worth it to the last character. So again, layers. And then the last one is detective. So should they get through your preventative controls, your deterrent controls, how do you detect that? How do you know what identities have actually come into your system or identities that may be sending things out of your system? So now let's take a look at layering on identity. And I want to talk about this from 2 different perspectives, one being from the outside in, and then as I mentioned earlier, we also need to look at this from the inside out. So starting off with the outside in, you want to have a zero trust architecture or get as close to that as possible. That is going to be a bit of a journey. Some people, or you may see some tools that say this is zero trust, and they may help you along on that journey, but that's not that's not the final stop. There's not one tool that's going to cover all the bases when it comes to zero trust architecture. And some of these items that you see here, such as multi-factor authentication and SSO, they play a role into that zero trust architecture. But again, there's this holistic approach that you're going to need to take. You'll also need to look at authorizations. So going back to the scenario of bots and service accounts, what are the authorizations that are being assigned to identities within your environment? How long are those authorizations valid for? And having an approach of, when an ID is disabled, making sure those authorizations are being disabled as well. On the right side, here I've mentioned about managing the identity of things. So having a repository of your identities that should be allowed within your environment. Additionally, you'll want to look at things like your segmentation and firewalls. So here, who should be allowed, which IP addresses should be allowed. And I'm considering those as identities as well. And then your roles and permissions. A lot of times it's easier to go with out of the box, but easy doesn't make it right. So you'll want to make sure that you're doing a good assessment of the roles and permissions that are being assigned. And then lastly, making sure you have some automated policies in place to check your security posture and make sure that as services are being deployed, you're not getting away from your ideal security posture and maturity. So now let's take a look at identity from the inside out. Like I've mentioned before, we don't want to forget that insider threats are just as valid as outside attacks. And when it comes to protecting identity from the inside out, there's a couple of main things that we want to look at. So the first being that you want some visibility. You'll want some type of tool that's going to give you that single pane of glass of user entitlements, those identities in your environment and their behaviors. And this also needs to include, not only those service accounts, but also things like APIs. So making sure you have a good way of tracking what APIs are being used in your environment and for what reasons. Next, you'll want to look at your admin users, securing your root users, making sure you secure your CLI. Who has access to this? Do they really need it? And are you logging what they're doing with that access? Next, you'll want to look at policies. So here, I mentioned this in two different ways. One, you'll want a formalized, documented policy for your internal users. And although this is basically a piece of paper, this can also act as one of those deterrent controls to tell someone that, maybe it's not worth it to perform this attack. But you'll also want some automated policies. So as developers and engineers are deploying things within your environment, making sure that you can automatically detect any deviation from your desired security posture or automatically roll those things back as well. And then last but not least is your access management. So what's your process around assigning least privilege and making sure that accounts have that least privilege? And if you can't get to a least privilege model, which some cloud providers, based on the roles that they give you, you really can't get to, making sure that you're logging that access and you're aware of what people are doing with it. So here's a list of the different identity tools and resources within the different cloud providers. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is, I think, will go a long way to helping you understand what's available within different areas. So I've categorized these under logging and monitoring, access and permissions, things related to MFA, identity management, and governance. And based on the different cloud providers, some are a little bit more mature in these areas than others. So you'll need to research and make sure that, if you decide to deploy some of these things, will it really cover the gaps within your environment? Will it keep you to the security posture that you're desiring? So a few questions that we'll need to ask to make sure that, yes, these tools will work for us, or do you need to go out and possibly purchase some additional tools or, go to something that's open source? You'll want to look at the strengths of what's already being provided within that cloud provider, those things that they do well. I won't call it out here for the different vendors, but some of them are stronger than others in particular areas. And so depending on your company's risk appetite, you may need to go out and purchase additional tools to support where you want to be. Next is opportunities. So what are your goals from a security standpoint for your particular company? And can the embedded tools from a cloud provider help meet those? If not, you'll want to consider some additional tooling. You'll also want to look at weaknesses and threats. So comparing what is weak in your environment, what threats that you're expecting against your environment versus the controls that are available within that cloud provider. So a few identity controls and best practices. I'll continue to harp on this, but least privilege, of course, that's going to be really, really important. Knowing what roles have allow all type of access and what's in your out of the box roles if you decide to use those. So don't just blindly use out of the box roles because we have to keep that cloud responsibility model in mind. There's that stat that says 60% of breaches occur because of cloud misconfigurations. And identity and access management is actually one of those things that you as a customer needs to be responsible for. Also leveraging groups for permission and assignment where possible so that you're not directly assigning access to one individual user. That gets hard to maintain over time. So leveraging groups is going to be your best bet there. And as much as you can, automating what you do with security. So compliance as code, policies as code. Some of the panelists mentioned this earlier. Again, you want to automate what you can. And for me, also building that inventory of identity so you know what is a known good when you're assessing which identities are connecting into your environment. So I've listed here some other tools to consider. I mentioned that within the different cloud providers that their default capabilities may not cover everything you need. And so it's my recommendation that you'll want to look at identity governance and provisioning platforms. Those are going to give you that single pane of glass of what users have across different environments. I have some thoughts on, best of breed and so forth, and I can mention those in the Slack chat, but I didn't want to put them here. You also want to go and have an identity program assessment done. So these are people who can help you determine where you have gaps in your identity program. Because identity in the cloud is so decentralized, pieces and parts are done by developers, maybe by a dedicated identity team. It's going to be helpful if you have someone with an outside lens to come in and say, what do you want your holistic program to look like? Additionally, you want to look at things like CASB, user behavior analytics, SIM for logging and reporting, and SASE. And if you're looking for some ways to do some comparisons of your security model to best practices, I've listed some items here, some resources that you can check out. And additionally, there's quite a few things on GitHub if you want to leverage those to assess where you may have gaps in your roles, in the way that you're managing secrets, and within default roles in the system. So the title of my talk was Identity in Depth, and I really had two purposes for this. So one is talking about that security piece of it, but then also we as individuals building some depth to our own identities. And what I mean by that is making sure that you're, not only building a skill within security, if you're focused as a developer or engineer, maybe building in or understanding business domains. Broadening your horizons when it comes to what you're capable of doing and investing in that knowledge that's going to help grow your career, both laterally and horizontally. And then if you're a little bit more seasoned in your career, make sure you consider mentoring others and pulling other people into the cybersecurity space. I feel like this is really important in that it's going to help you develop your own unique niche, your own unique point of view and problem solving for your company. That is going to help you grow into your career. So a few closing thoughts. Again, we need to reassess what we think of as perimeter for our environment. Now it truly needs to be identity when you consider your cloud environment. And then know the layers of identity that are relevant for your company. So I mentioned a few things like bots and APIs, and maybe your company's not using, bots or robotic processing, but understand what your company is using and build that inventory of what's relevant. And then remember that MFA is important, but it doesn't solve everything. So we still need to push MFA for users, for our companies, but making sure that we have a layered approach, a layered strategy behind that MFA. And then cyber hygiene is not going to go away. So we still need to make sure those basic things are being done within our environments, including things like a good password policy. Because until we can get to a point where we're passwordless, those type of things are still important. And then last but not least, making sure that we're considering both the insider and outsider threats, and that you're also building identity in depth for your individual career and skill sets. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, awesome, Shinesa. Hey, so got a few questions here. You've spent a lot of time building IAM capabilities, building IAM programs, and you talked about this a bit here in terms of that traditional approach to IAM and kind of this inside out, outside in, and what do you need to think about from a cloud perspective? When you've got your IAM team, what do you do to kind of convince them that they need to think about this a little bit differently? How do they go from continuing with the traditional approach, but then leveraging some of these new approaches that you were talking about? What's worked for you?
Well, I think there's two answers here. One, as soon as you get into the cloud and you start looking at permissions and roles and things like that, it becomes very apparent that you need to have a different mindset. Two, when it comes to building my own individual team, and I talked about this a little bit, and that you want some, broad skills. You don't want somebody that's single focused and thinks that the world only works one way. Expand your horizon on how things work.
And you mentioned this identity program assessment. What are some, over the years when you've had that done, what are some of the key findings that you consistently see, or what were some of the findings that were a surprise to you in those overall program assessments?
Yeah, I would say that consistently there's some duct tape when it comes to identity programs. So there's always this behind the scenes type of scripting that's happening that people aren't aware of. There's these siloed processes that aren't really visible in that single pane of glass that I mentioned. So doing an identity assessment really brings that to light, because it's going to bring together not only your identity team, not only your IT team, but people within your business departments who may know other things that are going on, like shadow IT, that you may not be aware of.
Great. And then, a lot of times the IAM from a traditional perspective might be focused on enterprise IAM or customer IAM or single sign-on, might be a federated single sign-on component of that. And when organizations are first moving to the cloud, you've got IAM capabilities built directly into the cloud providers, and there's kind of a separation, right, between what's done in the cloud and the traditional IAM team. How do you see that connect, right? And then also, where do you see, and where in your teams, where have you seen IAM sit? Does it sit in IT? Does it sit in the business unit? Is it in as a part of security itself? And what are the pros and cons of where the IAM team lives in relation to what they're doing from a cloud perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. With identity, so the core of that, the knowledge, the expertise, for me, sits with one team. But because with cloud environments, things are so, spread out that they're, a business user can spin up some cloud service, with a credit card. So making sure that you're also training and coaching people within your business so that they can be those identity champions of what's best practice, and making sure they bring those to, whatever it is that they're working on and supporting. Identity can't be in everything every day. So we need to make sure we're building those champions who are doing the work and can spot things that don't seem right or smell fishy, and bring those to the identity team where they can leverage our expertise on that.
Great. Hey, you mentioned some tools like CASB, and how does that it help the IAM team and the security team in terms of that additional visibility in what organizations, what people in the organization are actually doing?
Yeah. So I think that's another great question. For me, CASB is going to help in the sense that, we have our business users who are working from home, and you want to make life as simple as possible for them. They're not in the business of IT. So having a secure way for them to connect into an environment, having it be pretty seamless, I think that's where things like CASB help. It also goes back to that point of automation. So, security teams can't be everywhere all at once. And if there's a repeatable process, let's make sure that those things are automated, that we don't have to touch those things repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Now you mentioned identity champions just a moment ago, and there's working with dev teams, DevOps teams, there's this concept of having a champion on the dev team, that one person that is really knowledgeable about security. And different organizations call these different things, whether it be a champion or some call them primes, some call them mavens. And how do you go about finding that identity champion in those different areas?
Yeah, for me, within a company, you always want to build bridges to different areas. So going back again, I mentioned about, learn about business processes and connect with other people. How I identify people who can be those champions is basically, trying to build those relationships and seeing who has that aptitude to learn at least a little snippet of security. You don't want to overwhelm people with security because their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to ignore you. But, those people who are willing to take on just a little bit of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And then you build from there, because those people can then go champion to other people.
Mm-hmm. Great. In prior lives, I've had, the IAM team be in the security organization, IAM be a sister organization. Where's IAM sit right now in your organization, and what do you see are the trade-offs with that?
Yeah. So for me, IAM sits within our IT organization. I think the benefits to that are that, we're connected to our other IT partners. So as they're building technical solutions, we're, there to help say, think about this security strategy for identity. Where we kind of miss the mark a little bit is, again, going back to that business footprint. Understanding what the business needs are, what they're trying to accomplish from a strategy standpoint, and making sure that identity, fits or has a role into that. That identity is not driving their strategy, but helping to support their strategy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Definitely an enabling function.
Right.
Now, with the cloud, we've got AWS, we've got Azure, we've got GCP, and let alone all of the other SaaS providers. What do you tell your team? What would you recommend to people in terms of how they should start figuring this out, how learning about, you had it there at the end a little bit, but in terms of the differences and the similarities between the three major cloud providers, what would you suggest to them?
Yeah, and this is why I say, AJ was a little bit of a hard act to follow, because he touched on this as well, that each of the three cloud providers, they provide a free tier where you can go in and do some self-learning. And for the people that I mentor, I always encourage them to go in and do that and build a proof of concept for yourself and understand how those things work and integrate together. This also helps you understand the difference between those cloud providers, so that if you ever need to do that type of comparison, hands-on experience, what works, what doesn't work, which ones have, granular security, which ones don't. So.
Awesome. Well, hey, Shinesa, thank you so much for the talk. That was really great. And just a reminder to everybody, we're also in Slack in the hallway channel here. And just a reminder in terms of the link and the evals here for all of the speakers. So, hey, let's give Shinesa a virtual round of applause here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank.